this is a particular example of one or two citizen science projects, which are quite specific to and interest to Svalbard, because this is a project based upon Walrus, the Walrus from Space project, which is a joint project between British Antarctic Survey, where I'm from, and the World Wildlife Fund. But actually, it also involves many researchers who are walrus experts from around the Arctic. This project started about 3 years ago. We've done a lot of work in the Antarctic on penguins and things like that, looking at them and monitoring them by satellite. And we were asked by WWF if we could do the same for walrus in the Arctic. At the time, we were rather naive about walrus, and we said, yes, that we know that they can be seen by satellite, and we'll go ahead. It's been quite a learning experience, but the crowd have helped us immensely, and I'll come on to that in a second about how that's worked. So the walrus populations can be split really into three different species and subspecies. The Pacific walrus, which are the main population, is in the Bering and Chukchi Sea. And there's a subpopulation called the Laptev subpopulation, or the Laptev sea walrus, which is we think is a subpopulation of the Pacific walrus. And then there's the Atlantic walrus, which is a completely different species. Our study, for various reasons, concentrates on the Atlantic and the Laptev subspecies. So we're talking Canada, Greenland, Svalbard, and Russia, but not the US or the Chukchi Sea walrus. And the reason we're interested in walrus and the WWF are interested is because of two reasons. Walrus numbers are changing with climate change. Here you can see the sea ice extent is decreasing in the Arctic. The walrus haul out on the sea ice in the breeding season in the winter, and then come onto land in the summer when the sea ice melts. With the lack of sea ice, then we think that we're seeing a change in behavior, and we want to see if we can get data to work out whether this is affecting walrus numbers and the health of the population. What is the trend of the walrus population? But also, there is an increasing commercialization and industrialization of the Arctic, with extraction of minerals and carbohydrates and hydrocarbons, and more ship traffic and tourism. And all of those things disturb walrus, and there's a worry generally that more disturbance will also impact their numbers. So we were very keen to acquire lots of information about walrus populations over a 5-year period. So this is a 5-year project, to see if we can see any changes or link those changes that we do see to environmental drivers. And the way we were going to do this was by satellites. We were going to use the high-resolution Maxar constellation. The Maxar constellation has got many satellites, but I think it's this one here is the WorldView 3 satellite. We're using WorldView 3 and WorldView 2, but primarily WorldView 3. That's a very high-resolution satellite, gives information on the ground at a spatial resolution of about 31 centimeters. And we knew from a couple of publications that we could see and count walrus using this satellite. So our rather ambitious aim, was to take satellite imagery of the whole, every walrus haul out in the Arctic where we had Laptev and Atlantic walrus, and see if we could count them and find out what the population was over 5 years, and see if we could look at the trend. That was our initial aim, but as we went through the project, we realized that it was going to be a little bit more complicated than that, let's say. And the way we were going to count them was using citizen scientists. We knew from our experience in the Antarctic that citizen scientists and satellites could be really useful. There'd been a really groundbreaking project by a scientist called Michel Leroux, who used this information to count Weddell seals on the ice in the Antarctic, and had massive engagement and really useful for counting. We were using that as a basis to count the walrus in the Arctic with this Maxar imagery. So we set out several different objectives. The first one was to work out where the walrus were, then to get the Maxar, the satellite provider, to get imagery of all of the haulouts, each one of the next 5 years. As I said, we started this about 3 years ago now, so we're just coming up to the 3rd year of image capture. And then get the citizen scientists count walrus, and then we're looking at calibrating that, which we've started. I'll come on to that. Steps 5 and 6, trying to work out what the numbers are. That's further down the line, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. The first thing we realized was that we weren't exactly sure where all the walrus haulouts were. There were a lot of different sort of studies about walrus, but they were often very old, often incomplete. They hadn't captured the whole area, and very vague geographical sort of coordinates. Also, it became quite clear to us that walrus weren't always at the haulouts, even in the peak season. So as I said, walrus come onto land in the summer, and they come onto specific sites, but they don't always come back to the same site, and sometimes they can move about during the season. So the first thing for us to do, and the first thing that we got the citizen scientists to do, was to actually not just count the walrus, but actually find the walrus for them. Look at assessing the present absence. So we got imagery over the walrus haulouts, and here we go. This is the first years. So this is what we found, that we collated locations of 623 haulout sites, of which about 400 were Atlantic and Laptop walrus sites. And we tried to get imagery of all of these sites in the haulout season, which is generally between about June and October, but varies also regionally. And we got second objective was to get that satellite imagery. The first year we had 89% coverage from the satellite provider. The second year, actually, we've had 96% coverage, and the third year we had 95% coverage. So we got really good coverage. These are cloud-free images of all of the haulout sites. Remember, we're only really looking at these sites in this area, not the ones in this area. But we got the satellites to take imagery of all of the sites, just in case in future we do go into that area. So we're getting a huge amount of data here. Each of the satellites was broken up into a small image chip, 200 meters by 200 meters, and that made about 600,000 image chips. Obviously too many for us to count by a single person. But using the power of the crowd, we developed a citizen science app in collaboration with the satellite provider Maxar, who have the satellite. And the beauty of that is that we don't have to download all those 600,000 tiles. The satellite provider can keep them on their virtual computer back at home, and we also don't have to pay for the downloads either. So it's actually much cheaper to do it using citizen science than it is to actually purchase the images themselves. How much cheaper? About a tenth of the price. So although this is quite expensive imagery, you can really reduce the price by using a citizen science app. And this is what we see. This is a haul out in Russia, and this is what we can see on the ground. And as you can see, it's quite challenging to count individuals. You can just about make it. So we knew that one person wouldn't be able to count this accurately. So we use the wisdom of the crowd. We get multiple counters to count it. And then once we've got enough people counting it, we have a Gaussian curve of counts, and we can make some estimation of the average, but also the variability. We estimate that the higher the variability, the more difficult it is to count, and that gives us some inference about the quality of the counts. We can also get experts to count it, and we see that there is a skew between the expert counters and the citizen scientists, and that we're working on that at the moment. So the citizen science counts, we worked with Maxar, who have their own citizen science platform called GeoHive. You can log onto this, you can log into it today, and you can go and help us find the walrus. So the first part was to find the walrus. As I said, we had 600,000 tiles to assess for walrus. And of those, the first year we had about 20,000 20,000 citizen scientists take part. They found about 100 tiles with walrus in it. So we went from 600,000 to 100. One of the things that we found was that you don't want to have such a small positive sort of counting ratio. What you want is to keep the crowd engaged. So every 50 to 100 tiles, we would add in a false positive tile that we knew had walrus in it. And that also gave us the ability to test how well the citizen scientists were seeing walrus. If they missed all of the ones that we knew had walrus in them, we could test them out, and then we wouldn't have to use those counts. But if they were good and they found most of those, then we would use those counts, and then we would also pick out the ones that we didn't know were walrus. So it's quite an involved process. It took us about a year to actually make the app with Maxar. There were lots of things, and in the second year we improved it to add in more complexity and to add in that false positive part. And we're still improving it on a sort of almost 6 monthly basis. We'll be coming up to the third year now. We've just about finished the presence absence campaign for the first year, and we're just about coming to the third year. For the first year and the second year, we'll be taking imagery for the third year in the summer. The second part was, so here we go, presence, and it was just a simple, are there walrus there or are there walrus there? Present absence or a poor image, because some of them were poor images. The second part was the counting, and here you can see you've got walrus imagery, and people put dots on the walrus. Sometimes it's not quite as easy as that, and the walrus are all sort of mixed up and very close together. And there the counters will draw polygons around the data. We only actually asked for 55 of these images to be counted, and we got 100 people counting them, and 100 people completed 55 counts within about a week and a half. So it was very quick to do this. We had a lot of engagement from the crowd. We're also working with SIOS to look at the variability. As we said, one count often isn't enough because there's a lot of variability. We're using Sentinel data to look at variability. You can see here, this is Sentinel-2 data. These orange areas are walrus haul-outs over one season. And you can see that there is a lot of variability, and we're thinking of actually using the crowd to look at this imagery as well and assess when they can see haul outs or not, because obviously there's a great deal of data here. We've just starting a SIOS planet project, which will assess imagery of the high resolution planet constellation at a number of sites within Svalbard. We will get multiple images in a season, just to try and calibrate how good our counts are. Because if we have one count and there's quite a lot of weekly variability there, then we need to understand what that makes. We've also had an albatross citizen science project called Albatross from Space with the RSPB. That was a trial project in South Georgia where people went on and dotted albatross. And we're planning to expand that out to the whole of the Southern Ocean for every albatross colony in the Southern Ocean as an international project over the next year or so with the RSPB and other NGOs. NGOs are very keen on this because it not only gives them the science data they require, but also, as we were saying earlier, it gives them a massive amount of public engagement and shows that the NGOs are doing good work as well. So we're getting funding from NGOs to do this as well as from the traditional providers. So that was the talk, really. We're looking maybe to do other wildlife and space projects on the app. The app is there. I'm sure that GeoHive is very keen to extend the use out of that counting and present absence app. It is a really good way not just to get science data and to count huge data sets, but also to get engagement from the public and to give democratizing science, as we said earlier. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the inspiring presentations. Through a project called Svalbard, we try to bring together knowledge, different ways of knowing of the environment and looking at environmental change as such. And what we see is that people there hold rich local knowledge because of a long time, intense experiencing of an environment that is in your face. And the likes of Jörn and several others worked in scientific institutions, and by doing so, they influence science through the back door, through diffusion, by effectively influencing how people think and work and doing their science as scientists. And here's one of our informant's quotes. Personally, this person said, "I think this funding might not have been won had it not been for the insights provided by a casual conversation with a local resident, which helped us to take on a more integrated ecosystem approach." And this diffusion, this influencing science through backdoor, is very clear feature of science in Svalbard. You can also go and capture this local knowledge actively. And this is also what we've tried to do, to get to this holistic experience of the environment by interviewing people, scientists and technicians, tour guides, and having focus groups and finding ways to understand how those very experienced, experiential people have looked at change, and some of the work we've now started to write up. You can ask me or any of my colleagues about those studies, and I can send you. We also have the survey running, a Maptionnaire, where people of all sorts locally could submit their own experiences, something that gets far closer to what we recognize as citizen science, labeled community science. What was also quite striking is that in this working with scientists and tour guides and the kind of tour operating industry, is that there's a great desire for more citizen science on Svalbard, both among scientists and among tour operators, and the latter ideally seeing this to happen with scientists involved. And that would be influencing science not through the back door, but through the front door. The question is, so what citizen science do they have in mind? As we've seen from the two previous presentations, citizen science can be looked at very broadly. This is one definition, actually made it to the Oxford Dictionary. Scientific work undertaken by members of the general public, often in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. So this is a very specific flavor of citizen science, and it builds on naturalists like René and Darwin, from which sprung naturalist societies, which have morphed into digital recording communities. And eBird is a classic example of that, operating in a massive scale that Darwin and Linné surely not would have imagined to be possible. Citizen science of very specific type. And they do amazing things. So this is not a map of the world, this is records of the world, mapping the world. eBird is in many people's eyes the kind of image of what citizen science is able to achieve. And they have indeed achieved mapping the bird world at this global scale. Quite impressive. But of course, they didn't do that out of nowhere. They had to put in an awful lot of infrastructure, very impressive operations, and working from a community that was there. It's data gathered by birders for birders, then of course also used by others. And this principle, this data trickles up, and biodiversity data is gathered by GBIF, and here's a flavor of what GBIF Sweden does. I could have also put Norway up, very similar picture, but you can see an enormous density of observations, biodiversity observations in this Nordic country. And at the bottom graph, what in this case the Swedes do abroad. So an enormous span of data. And this is data gathered by naturalists. So again, it is not citizen science that starts from nowhere. It starts from existing structures, and it builds on deep interests and people's relationship with nature. And that feeds into phenomenal data. And here's the top 10 data series in GBIF of the world. You see Norway here nicely sitting in the middle. Quite remarkable, very small countries. Sweden is the second. And their small countries apparently didn't hinder them to be major depositories of data, largely because the digital has been adopted very early on and have very strong traditions in terms of biological recording. And that combined means that a lot of data can be gathered in that sphere. But there's many different kinds of citizen science, and you can cut the cake in many different ways, and this is one of those ways where people look at different forms of citizen science as different levels of participation. The top model, most commonly, where people asked to contribute to scientists, contribute data of whatever kinds. We've seen examples of that today. Second, much rarer form is where the design perhaps is largely driven by scientists, but where there's a lot of influence of people on the process of research. And the third, much rarer, is where there's genuine co-creation, or actually even process driven by non-scientists, where scientific methods are used, and where at least participants are actively involved in all the steps of the scientific process. But you can see in terms of the dots on the left-hand side that those co-created examples are very rare, as well as the collaborative ones. And the question is, well, does that matter? Well, arguably not, or perhaps it does. It's very clear that if you look at it from a scientific perspective and you're interested in producing papers, then the top model really works. But you can ask yourself, so what is best for society? And then perhaps other forms, maybe mainly prioritization. So a lot of these ideas about citizen science working well stem from the fact that we have these giants like eBird doing fantastic things working from existing structures. But of course, there's also work with untrained audiences, as we've seen today, and that can be very, very productive. Zooniverse is one of these platforms, creating an enormous amount of interest. And as Zooniverse says, here anyone can be a researcher. But of course, this is welcoming people into a process, which you also have to ask yourself, so what happens to this person then itself? And there, it's perhaps worth asking what other definitions of citizen science are around. And here I'll read this very long thing out, because in black, it shows what the idea is, according to this definition adopted by the Citizen Science for Europe panel, for example. Where we have the general public engagement in scientific research, actively contributing, providing data, raising new questions, co-creating a new scientific culture. And in green, what people get out of it. Volunteers acquire new learning and skills, deeper understanding. And in red, what society might benefit from. Science-society policy interactions are improved, and more democratic research may be coming out of it. So this is, again, something which you've seen already this morning, but a very different definition of citizen science, perhaps worth keeping in mind. And other people push that yet further and ask, so what is citizen science actually doing for environmental citizenship, for changing how we deal with the planet? In that sense, asking what kind of citizen science we need on Svalbard and other places is, I think, an important question to ask. And then particularly asking not only what citizen science does for the science, but also for the citizen. Citizen science, because of these success stories like eBird, is often sold as a panacea, and many funders view it as such. And it can do amazing things, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily a fix for all your problems. This is a portrayal of citizens and scientists in the process. And you can look at either panel, it's about the colors. So in purple is how citizens portray themselves in the process as participant, as partner, as volunteer, as unpaid. And in blue, you can see how scientists describe themselves in communication around citizen science, as researcher, as educated, as employed. So there's clearly discrepancy in terms of power and what people get out of it. And this is, I think, a very important issue for citizen science as an endeavor. And there are darker sides of citizen science, and I don't blame any project about it, but I think it's important to think about them. You have to ask where citizen science sits in terms of neoliberalization of science. Asking whether it indeed creates cultures that are productive and helpful to society, or perhaps extractive. Whether data are actually useful and used. Who gains knowledge in the process and for what? And does it really change the relationship between science and society? And surely it can, but I think having this on your mind is helpful, and particularly who is empowered in the process. If we think that citizen science is indeed a force for good in society beyond gathering of data. Running a citizen science project is not easy either. And the two previous speakers will know that by heart. And this is an overview of the challenges organizers of citizen science indicate themselves. You can see all very high values in terms of difficulties of keeping things going financially, in terms of quality, and how much time it takes. So it's not a free-for-all, although it can be cost-effective, as Peter pointed out, in certain ways. So in that sense, I think asking how to get citizen science right is important, and it's not a trivial question. But I think it all starts with your motivations and being honest about them. So why, as an organizer, if you set out to do citizen science, for example, on Svalbard, what are your motivations for this? Honestly. And ask yourself what should be achieved, and communicating those goals so that people actually know what you're about and where they step into. And ask yourself who is involved. It's very rare that the answer is everyone. This is typically how it's portrayed, but this is not realistic. I think it's important to be selective, ask what your audience is, and consider what their motives might be. Why might an individual be interested in your project? And can they really see what you're after? And then how to go about. And I think here we go back to the likes of Jan Duttal and others. People hold very, very rich understanding of the environment in different ways. You can see it also in the presentation of Nuria, where people locally, of course, know air quality much better than any model can tell them. So respect those knowledges and expect expertise of people. I don't necessarily expect that they hold very little and simply can do things because we ask them to. And create opportunities for learning and shaping the process, and their feedback is very, very important. I think that then connects to the motivations and keep these circles going to be reflective on the process. I think by doing so, amazing citizen science can emerge.